Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to be taking a look at audio connections in Cubase. So this is something where you may never need to know that much about it. If you're just working on a laptop with a stereo in and output, or if you're just using one audio interface, you may never need to know this. But if you're using a more complicated setup, if you want to do anything with control room, etc., or if you're transferring your songs between different setups, so maybe it's going between you and a friend who has a different audio setup, or between a studio which has lots of ins and outs and your setup which only has stereo in and out, then you're going to need to know how to do some of the things shown in this video. So with no further ado, let's take a look. So here you can see a Cubase project set up, and this isn't actually where we're going to be looking because we're going to head straight to the studio menu and go to Studio Setup. So that may be labeled differently, and this window may look different in older versions of Cubase, but all the options are pretty much the same. Now, here at the top of this left-hand side of the window, we can see the audio system. Previously, this would have had VST, etc. in there. It now just says audio system. And here is where we pick the driver. So this is one of the things which, even if you're just using a laptop, you may have different options. Here I've got two worthwhile options here. So I've got the built-in audio, which is the Max hardware, or I've got a Behringer 4-in and 4-out audio interface attached. So I'm going to switch back to built-in audio. And you'll see that Cubase asks if we want to switch the audio driver, because it always wants to make sure you're not going to change something you don't want to, purely because this effectively upsets the inputs and outputs. So I'm going to hit switch and then hit OK. And now we're going to look in the window we're actually interested in, which is the audio connections window. So again, it's under studio. We've got audio connections. It used to be called VST connections, I believe, but there we go. So this is the window we are concerned with, this window here. So we have these tabs across the top. I think it defaults normally to being on outputs, but we're going to start on the inputs tab. So whenever you record any audio, you will need an input. And the idea of this window is to divorce the logical ins, so the buses in Cubase, from the physical device ports, as it calls here. So this is the actual physical input in the case of my Mac. So what this allows you to do is to be more flexible. The idea is that if we change to a different driver, stereo in will still exist, but it will be connected to different ports. So we're going to see that in a second. So in a second, I'm going to switch back to the Behringer, and then you'll see that stereo in still exists, but instead of using built-in audio left and right, it will use different ports on there. So let's do that now. So I'm just going to close the window, go back to Studio Setup, and then swap over to the UMC. And now back in our audio connections window, you can see, although it's still called stereo in with left and right, it's changed to being the UMC, and now it's in 1 and 2. So this is the first thing. It's designed to make it so that if you're just working on stereo systems, you're going between, let's say, your Mac and your friend's PC. If you're just using stereo in and out, you should never need to worry about this. But occasionally it falls down. So sometimes what happens is you end up with no sound, and you'll end up with not connected. Here, I've seen this less often recently, but it does happen, particularly on output. So you send someone a project and they say, well, it looks like it's playing, but nothing's happening. And that's because the outputs may have been changed. So let's go back to the inputs for the moment. Here we can pick what inputs we want. So let's say we had a stereo source connected to inputs 3 and 4. So we can just pick them here. So our left will come from input 3, our right will come from input 4. And now, even though it's still called stereo in, it will come from inputs 3 and 4 on the Behringer instead of 1 and 2. So far, so good. Now let's take a look at the outputs. So here on the outputs, it's very much the same. You can see that it's coloured differently, which is probably to remind you that these are outputs rather than inputs, but we've got the same deal. We can expand this stereo out here. We can see that the Behringer has been set to use output 1 and 2, but in fact, if we wanted to, if we had our speakers or something connected to out 3 and 4, we could change those. And it also gives you an indication of what they're currently being used for here. So if we had some weird setup where one speaker was connected to 1, but our other speaker was connected to 4, we could easily set that up like that, etc. We're totally flexible here. But say one thing that sometimes happens is people say, my project looks like it's playing, but nothing's happening. And if that's the case, this is one of the areas you should check. So firstly, check you are actually using the right driver. Secondly, check that you are using the right outputs. So here you can see it says output not connected. And by connecting this to the appropriate outputs, output 1 for left and output 2 for right, there we go, and playing the project, it would now play back and you would hear it okay. So that's a basic look at the audio connections window and how it works when you change drivers. So this has probably been the most common reason for people needing to go into this window, because they've got a project from somewhere and for whatever reason Cubase hasn't correctly mapped the outputs from that incoming project into the system that you're working on, and while it looks like it's playing, you get no audio out of Cubase, and it's like a mystery. I've seen people go, oh, I need a new sound card, my speakers are broken, and the problem is there are loads of different places where this can go wrong. So obviously there could be something actually muted in your project, or your final output might not be working for whatever reason. Occasionally people have the fader down and they just haven't realized that. But more often, it's things such as the driver not having been selected, the outputs not being selected there. If you ever get that kind of situation, try and break it down by maybe playing audio from a media player, etc., from the computer, because then if that does work, you know that your outputs are at least working and the speakers are working, etc. With all of this fault finding, you need to try and isolate one thing at a time and make sure that you know things are working, and never make assumptions, because assumption is the mother of all screw-ups, as they say, and it's definitely the case here. So never assume anything if you get no audio out. Check one thing at a time. Say normally in Windows, or at Mac Media Player, etc. Just play an audio file on VLC. If that works, then you know you're okay. But always make sure you're actually looking in the right place by testing those kind of things. And typically with problems like that with Cubase, it will be because it hasn't switched over to the right inputs or outputs, and that's why it's not working. Now let's take a look at selection of inputs. So here we have a mono track, and in the inspector here we can pick any available mono suitable audio inputs. So here it's currently set to left stereo, which is the kind of thing you often see. So that means it will take its audio from the left side of the stereo input pair. You can pick the right side here or any other suitable mono source. So a stereo source in the case of Cubase here is made up of 2 mono sources, and that's why you can pick it. So if we were on the right one, we could pick that, etc. In the case of stereo, we only see stereo suitable sources. So we see the whole stereo in here, which in this case would be left or right. If you want any more flexibility than that, then you would need to set that up in the audio connections window. So let's take a look at that now. So here we are on the input side, and we can create new buses. Now, I used to do this quite a lot, but I've sort of veered away from creating everything so much all the time. But let's look at the all-encompassing, all the options are taken care of setup we could have here. So first things first, we're going to put this back. So this is on 1 and 2. Now, let's say sometimes we have another stereo source that we want to record at the same time. So I want to record from inputs 1 and 2 on one stereo source and inputs 3 and 4 on another one. We can do that. We just need to add a new bus. So we're going to click Add Bus here. We only want to add one, but we want to make it stereo. And I'm going to call it stereo 3, 4, because that makes sense. Going to click Add Bus, and handily Cubase has assigned the remaining ports here, 3 and 4. But if you have more ports available, you may need to select them. So just in the same way as before, you just click there and pick up the menu. So now, back on our stereo track, we can pick stereo in, which is stereo 1 to 2, or stereo 3 to 4. And that will now record from the appropriate input. If I want to record 2 stereo tracks, I'll just add a new stereo track here. I'm going to pick this one to come from stereo in, and I'm going to go stereo track 1 to 2. So that one is going to record from 1 to 2. This one is going to record from 3 to 4. We can now record 2 stereo tracks at the same time. Now, selecting for a mono track, here we can see that because we've now created those 2 stereo inputs, we can pick from left and right on stereo in or left and right on stereo 3 to 4. So we've got the option to pick from input 1, 2, 3, and 4. I've never been a huge fan of that because it's always seemed slightly confusing to me, particularly in the middle of a session. So what I would normally do with this kind of situation is cover all the bases by opening up the audio connections window, and then I'm going to click add bus, and this time I'm going to change to mono, and I'm going to add 4 inputs, and I'm going to call it mono in 1, and hopefully it will rename them sensibly. And we see, unfortunately, let's make the window a little bigger. Unfortunately, it doesn't assign these appropriately, probably because they're not free. I think if you have inputs that weren't already taken, it will assign them. But here, we're just going to assign mono in 1 to in 1, which already is. Mono in 2 is going to be from input 2. Mono in 3 will be in 3. And mono in 4 will be in 4. So here we have all of the bases covered. So we've got a stereo input for each pair, and then we've got each one addressable individually, which reduces a bit of confusion, say, particularly in the middle of a complicated recording session. So now when we go back to our mono track, we can pick from those stereo buses, but I'm going to just pick mono in 2. So let's say we wanted to record our stereo track on 3 and 4. We have mono in 2 here, and then maybe we can add another mono track here. Now, we're going to come back to what appears in this window. This isn't in all versions of Cubase. Previous versions didn't do this, but for the time being, we're just going to pick mono in 1 and say mono track in 1. So now what we could do, I'm just going to put that there. We could record on this track, and this one, which is coming from 3 and 4, all at the same time, and they will get their individual tracks. So let's say you had a stereo keyboard here, and you had a guitar mic here, and a vocalist here. You can record all of those simultaneously by doing that routing. Now, there's one last feature which has only recently been introduced to Cubase, which is where you can connect directly to a hardware input. So that's what appeared previously. Now, what I'm going to do is change my previous setup for reasons that will become apparent in a second. So just going to delete mono in 3 and delete mono in 4. So we've just got mono in 1 and mono in 2, which are connected to these 2 tracks here. So let's say you want to create a new track and map it to an input which doesn't currently exist. You can do that directly mapping to the hardware. So let's make a new mono track. So here we've got mono in, and we can see here we can select these hardware inputs, and in 3 currently, because I just deleted it, is not accessible via one of these buses, but we can pick in 3. I'm going to call it mono track in 3, just so we know. And you can see that's called it mono in 3, brackets in 3. And if we go in here, we can see it's automatically created that. It's given it a rather lengthy name, but certainly it's covering all the bases. If you want to rename it, you can, of course, do so. Just double click and then name it however you'd want. But that's the way you can do that. So rather than coming into this window to create them, you can effectively create these audio connections directly from the Add Audio Track dialog box. So there you have the ways that you can route inputs, which can be useful, say, particularly if you've got a multi-input card. If you've got something with 8 or 16 inputs, it's definitely worthwhile to spend a bit of time setting this up. But when you've set it up, what you're probably going to want to do is to save this as a preset, because your situation may change. And if you've got a lot of inputs, if you've got, 16 or 24, the list can get a bit bewildering. And certainly I find in my studio here that I often only want to record from a particular set of inputs. And that will vary depending on the situation. So I've set up a few presets, and we're just going to look at how you would set those up, which makes recalling them much easier. So here we have the setup that we saw before, where we've got our 2 stereo inputs and those mono ins. In fact, I'm going to just rename this one to stereo 1 to 2 because it's a little more consistent. So now we know exactly what's going on with all of these. Now, I think as soon as you've got a setup you like, you should save it as a preset, because sometimes things will go wrong. I found with the earliest versions of Cubase 11, sometimes it deleted the settings that you had, which it was trying to be helpful, because what it used to do was create an immense number of presets, like all of the mono inputs possible and all of the stereo inputs possible and so on, which weren't that helpful. But it seemed that certainly in the early ones, often things got lost. So saving a preset is a good idea, and it's easily done. So we can click on the little triangle here. We can click Save Preset and give it a name. So I'm going to do stereo, all, stereo, and mono. And that's saved now. And it doesn't matter what else happens. So if I change sound cards and mess all this up or lose these inputs, etc., it's not a problem, because I can recall this really quickly, providing I've got the same audio driver selected. Everything will be exactly as I want. And this is particularly important when you're transferring projects between studios. So let's take a look at what happens if you change driver. So I'm going to change driver here, as we've seen before. So change back to built-in audio, click switch. And this is why I asked you, because when we go back to the audio window, we can see here it's done its best. So 1 and 2 have become built-in audio left and right. But obviously stereo 3 and 4 can't be connected to anything worthwhile, because we only have 1 and 2 left and right inputs. We don't have 4 inputs here. So this has then become slightly messy. But the useful thing is that these stay present in your project, even though they're not coming from anywhere, so that you wouldn't be able to record from them. But it is useful because it means that then if you transfer this project back to the setting where you have it, you'll be able to recall it easily. So if we go back to the driver for the Behringer, let's take a look again. So you can see what's happened here is in 1 and 2 have been reinstated, but these have not been connected. And this is why you use a preset, because we just select the preset here, go for all stereo mono, and instantly we're back exactly where we wanted to be. Works great, particularly at the moment where people are often transferring projects between studios if you're not meeting up, or you found that remote working works better for you. The output side works exactly the same, so I'm not going to show you that. It's generally the case that once your output's set up, you're pretty much there. Most people are only going to be using stereo outputs unless you're using control room. So control room is something we'll be covering in a future video, and it's something that you need to use if you are using VST Performer to connect between studios, etc. But the issue with that is that it can mess up your original output preset. So you might find that if you turn VST Connect off, you then end up with no output. So I've taken in my studio to just saving an output preset, even though it's just a stereo out, because then it means if anything like that happens, it's literally just a click away to reinstate it, get it back to where it was. So we've covered inputs, and outputs is much the same, as already mentioned. Next tab is group and effects, which at the moment is empty. Now, if we click add group here, let's call it stereo group 1. We see it's just a normal stereo group. So if we create one via the normal means, that's there. So if you ever need to change your group audio routing quickly, if you've got a big project and you don't fancy scrolling to the right of the monitor, of the mixer, etc., then you can change its output routing here. So here we could route stereo group 1 into stereo group 2, as you often find with subgroups, etc., that kind of thing. The same deal goes with effects. So if you quickly need to change your routing of your groups or your effects channels, you can press F4 and then load that up pretty quickly, rather than, say, wading through the monitor and then having to wade back to the channels you were dealing with earlier on. So next up is external effects and external instruments. Now, these will be covered in future videos on the channel, but in brief, this allows you to create routings for external audio effects and external MIDI instruments to allow them to work in the same transparent way that a VST instrument or a VST effect does. It works really well once it's set up, but it does have a couple of limitations. You need to permanently allocate the inputs and outputs that are needed for it and MIDI, and mixdowns have to be done in real time. But other than that, it works really well, and these are functions we'll be looking at in some future videos. Next up is Control Room. Now, Control Room will be being covered in a future video on the channel, but in brief, it allows you much more flexibility than the standard stereo out, where when you solo something, you are effectively using the main stereo out to monitor through. So it gives you the monitoring, which is much more like you would find in a real, in quotes, mixing desk, and gives you flexibility to give performers different mixes, etc. It's much more complicated than the stereo output, but the main reason I mention it here is that sometimes if you turn it on and maybe dabble about with it, when you go back to your standard setting, or maybe you've needed to turn it on for VST Connect reasons, you can find that then suddenly your outputs don't work, etc. in projects that you load up. So again, having a preset saved for your outputs is useful. So Control Room, say, is definitely useful and worthwhile in larger setups, but if you're just using stereo in and out, it's probably best left at the moment because it doesn't give you as much as maybe you might need, but you'd need more hardware for that. So now let's take a look at what happens when you transfer projects between machines which have different setups. So in this case, I'm going to take a project which I've been working on this week from my main DAW, which has a PreSonus 1824. I'm then going to put that onto the Mac and we'll see the differences it's make. Now, this is something which I'm doing all the time at the moment because I'm often working with clients where they have Cubase in their studio, they do some recording. I then transfer the whole project over to my studio and I have a different setup. I will do some, mixing, editing, flying in tracks, etc., from other remote musicians, and then transfer the whole thing back. So it's doing this fairly regularly. So this is something that, remote work, you're going to need to do this kind of thing, or if you're sharing projects with friends, etc. So let's take a look at it now. So here we are on the Mac. Just going to load this project up. And we can see we've got a few plugins missing. That doesn't matter because we're not actually going to be listening to the project. And you get this missing ports window come up. Now, this shows that we've got some audio ports and also a MIDI port, GS Wavetable synth, which genuinely was being used at one point in the project by the client. Yes, I know. Here we have the different stereo ports, which you could map, but in fact what I'm going to do is leave those, and then I'm just going to do them in the audio connections window because I think that works a little better. So just going to click OK here. Now if we load the window up, we can see that on the inputs, this is one of my studio setups. So at the moment nothing is connected, and we can see we've got these missing ones, all of which haven't mapped to anything sensible. So we've got VST Connect, because that's what I was using, a single mono in, which is from a previous interface, so I need to be slapped on the wrist for that, and stereo in, etc. But you can see none of this has mapped. It's saying that it's either they're missing and not connected, or they're just not connected. So normally what you would do is you would go through and map this to something sensible. So here, what I'm going to map this to is 1 and 2 for this. 3 and 4 for this one, 3 and 4 for this one as well, just in case I want to record on that. And then that would be 1. Now, this VST Connect, I'm going to leave not connected because that would only happen if I started using VST Connect on the Mac, which I'm not going to do. And then we'll also check the outputs, because the output, fortunately, has done something sensible, but sometimes you find that it doesn't interpret that correctly and you get not connected here. So with that set up, I'm now going to save a new preset here, which is going to be Studio Transfer. So again, I'm just going to do Save Preset. Call it DJ Studio Transfer. And now I will not have to do that again. So if I've loaded up a project which has been using my studio setup as it was, I won't have to do anything with that. That will just work. And away we go. It's worth noting that if I was to transfer that project back to the Studio DAW, then the same process would need to occur. And that's why I've saved the preset on there, so it's a few clicks away. That process also needs to happen when I transfer it back to the client. Otherwise, they will have no input and probably no outputs as well. It's straightforward to do, and I reflexively do it in any studio now that I'm in. I just save a new preset, because then I know if I transfer a project to them, I can just click a few buttons or tell them to click a few buttons, and we'll be exactly where we should be and everything will work again. So there you go, a look at the audio connections side of Cubase. Now, as mentioned at the beginning, this isn't something that most people necessarily need to get into, but it's the kind of thing that if you ever do need to know it, it will be really important, because it's the difference between not being able to use Cubase or being able to use it. Setting up inputs appropriate for your studio is something that will take a few iterations. So you might find initially you set everything up and you're like, oh, I want all of the inputs available. And after a while, you might just go, no, I only ever use 2 stereo inputs and 3 monos, and that's it. And I don't need 32 separate input channels, etc. But as ever, this is the kind of thing that you need to just spend a bit of time practicing and honing it down to where it works for you. And once you've got it and saved a few presets, it'll just be straightforward, rather than something that, leads to wailing and gnashing of teeth. As ever, I hope you found this video useful, and if you have, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.